Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of Conversations with Therapists. Today we'll be speaking with Dr. Adam Miller. Dr. Miller is a licensed clinical psychologist based in Woodmere who specializes in helping people cope and heal from grief and loss. So, Dr. Miller, just to get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got to work so closely with those struggling with grief?
Yes, hi, Sherry. It'd be my pleasure. So I'll tell you that I was originally trained as a clinical psychologist in a more general sense, and a lot of times what I found over the course of a lot of years of working with people in private practice that the issues that many people came to the fore with, very often depression and or anxiety, did not actually stem from things that had happened in the more present circumstances that might have brought them in the door, but instead really were things that had emanated from their past. Very, very often, these individuals had experienced some type of loss, whether loss of a close loved one, a relative. It could also be loss of functioning that they had experienced, certain losses of attachments that they had of various types of relationships that caused them to later be able to experience the anxiety and depression that they had come presently to deal with. Um, that led me on a pathway of trying to really get a deeper understanding into the intricacies associated with loss, grief, bereavement. And in the course of my work with individuals in those stages, those critical moments of their lives, I found it to be extremely gratifying to be able to offer um, a lending ear and some source of comfort for helping them process through those intense experiences that they had experienced that very often were not adequately addressed. And
Mhm.
so they are later reflected in the current symptoms that they came with.
Mhm. No, that's very interesting. I just wanted to hone in on one point that you made. You mentioned that grief could be related not to just a personal loss, but also some sort of loss of functioning or loss of a relationship. Can you explain a little bit more about how grief can, like, how someone can experience grief in more ways than just specifically a loss of a loved one?
Yes. So the basic understanding of grief is when we go through a loss of someone who we love dearly. That could be a parent, could be a sibling, it could be a spouse, it could also be a pet. That's the more traditional understanding of loss, and the grief that follows in its wake is a very normal part of the human experience, human condition. However, if we were to think of grief as a dynamic in which we are separated from an object that we have grown attached to. So certainly people in our lives, in our closest circles, certainly fit that mold, but it also includes other types of situations that people encounter. So that if someone had, for instance, defined him or herself by their job, and something happens whereby they're not able to work at that job any longer. They once were successful at whatever type of career that they had, and now they are retiring or were let go from a position that they had once enjoyed greatly and derived a lot of satisfaction and had derived a lot of meaning and purpose from. So when those individuals are now faced with those losses, so they are also experienced as forms of grief.
Hmm.
Um, the dynamic is the same. The objects that were lost may be different. And what we're trying to do in therapy is to try to help people make sense of what it means to have experienced loss. And how does one go about processing that in a way that that individual can heal instead of bearing the burden that grief entails that may last a lifetime, unfortunately, if it's not dealt with adequately.
Yeah, it's so interesting to expand the definition of grief in that way because, in a sense, I see what you're saying. Like the feelings of loss might be similar throughout the different circumstances, but I feel like a lot of times people might invalidate those feelings if they're going through a different type of loss other than like losing a person because they're like, oh, it's just a job. I should get over it. Like, why is it so difficult for me to move on? But when you put it in this perspective, that definitely helps it make more sense. So, how would you say that grief can affect someone's mental health? I know you mentioned it could be related to feeling anxiety or depression. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yes. So classical symptoms of grief, what we would call uncomplicated grief, your garden variety type of grief, certainly is going to entail very intense depressed mood. It's going to entail situations where people can become almost very moody, where their moods might shift and swing from one pole to the very opposite one. One moment they may be crying hysterically. The next couple of minutes later, they might be laughing. Um, and were someone to have been observed doing that without being in a grief state, they might have been deemed to have had some type of mood condition. In grief, that's normal. The intensity of affect that is displayed is par for the course when it comes to grief reactions. And the intensity is what really identifies that. Because of the intensity, um, very often the symptoms can be debilitating. So that when someone is overcome with that sadness, the person might not be able to concentrate. They might experience certain somatic symptoms, such as an upset stomach. They might have headaches. They might feel their chest, tightening up. At that point, sometimes people seek treatment because they're concerned about the toll that the grief is taking on their physical function.
Mm-hmm.
There are times that people are unable to go to work because they are not able to maintain their composure for a significant amount of time, enough that they can complete the types of tasks that are asked of them in the workplace in a normal work setting.
Mm-hmm.
So that is also something that can happen as well. There are often existential issues that arise in the context of grief because someone is now facing the ultimate unknown that we have in their lifetimes. And as a result of that, very often people ask the questions, why? Why this? Why that? Why are we here? What is the function? Why are we alive? What is the function of life? What's the purpose of it all? So there are myriad responses to those types of questions, but very often grief serves as the springboard for which people can start to ask them and
Mm-hmm.
ask them in a way that affects them very deeply. People are looking for some types of comfort, some types of reassurance that they can once again have a sense of control over their lives. But very often the experience of grief is the very opposite of that. And hence
Mm-hmm.
it's very, very disturbing to someone who is grieving, especially when prior to the loss that an individual experienced, that person was feeling very secure in who they are as a person, as well as also what their future may look like. During grief, all of that is disrupted.
Mm-hmm.
So one is in a figurative sense cast into some type of whirlwind, and the person doesn't necessarily know how they're going to wind up upon coming out of that experience. So it's a very a lot of negative emotions that are wrapped into one that are swirling around and over which a person ultimately does not have control. That doesn't mean to say that a person is constantly or persistently in that state of being. It's not that a person can't experience moments of happiness and joy, Certainly that can happen. It's just that it happens more frequently, this whirlwind of emotion that
Mhm.
overtakes the person. And in the course of the process of grieving, those types of experiences do decrease in their frequency and the duration of those episodes. That's a normal situation where that's a normal type of grief experience. Um, you can have complicated grief, and complicated grief is more pathological from a mental health standpoint, in that the individual who's experiencing complicated grief, their longing for that loved one doesn't cease over time. Not only that, it may even intensify over time from the time of the loss moving forward. The person is unable to part with the past. They're constantly bringing the past into the present. It's very difficult for them to be able to think even about moving in a forward direction in their lives. In a regular grief situation, uncomplicated grief, that individual certainly may miss their loved one or loved object. That doesn't necessarily diminish, but they're able to make sense of it. And they're able to incorporate that into their new sense of self as they go forward and involve themselves in other relationships. They're able to invest of themselves in other loving relationships with other objects of love. Someone who unfortunately experiences complicated grief is unable to do that. They are constantly mired in the past relationship that was lost and are unable to really invest in a healthy manner in new relationships.
Mhm. So it sounds like someone who's maybe it leads well into my next question, because my next question was going to be, when does normal grief turn into grief that one would need to seek help for? So it seems by what you're saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that once you hit that transition into more complicated grief, that's when someone um, might want to seek help to get through that process.
Well, that for sure, Sherry. I would certainly say that at a minimum. What I would also tell you, though, is that even in situations where someone is experiencing what would be called an uncomplicated bereavement, the grief is proceeding as you would have expected it to. That it's starting to lessen its intensity over the course of time. People are able to process things more. But if that individual lacks adequate social support from either family and or friends and or community, the person really feels that he or she is experiencing these conditions of grief alone. So that also itself is a signal that the individual does require some type of help coming from often from professional resources in order for that individual to not go through the process in a way that they may very often doubt what they're experiencing. They may doubt their own reality. They may experience the loneliness of going through the existential questions that we talked about earlier, to go through all that alone. The
Mhm.
value of having psychotherapy in those situations should never be underestimated, even though the person may be experiencing normal reactions to a loss. But it's extremely important that the person understands that grieving alone is actually could be very harmful to the individual. Um, if someone is blessed to have a social network, so psychotherapy might not be indicated, might not be necessary. Psychotherapy can be extremely helpful in helping someone work through that process when they feel that they're going at it by themselves. Um, this is also where group therapy, group counseling for people who have suffered a loss of various types can also be very helpful, because in those settings, a person may achieve a sense of belonging, a sense of not being judged. It's a safe place to be able to explore and express various types of feelings and experiences, to be able to receive a certain sense of their experiences being normalized by others who are in the trenches with them. And very often, people who experience the group process of therapy, when it comes to dealing with issues of grief of all different types, they often report feeling understood.
Mm-hmm.
And that in itself can be extremely rewarding, psychologically speaking, and existentially speaking,
Mm-hmm.
for those who participate in that process.
Mm-hmm.
So, certainly when it comes to complicated bereavement, as mentioned earlier, where the reaction, the grief reaction is one that um, is not resolving, um, is ongoing and perhaps over time even intensifying. And when that happens, it starts to also take over other areas of life. So
Mm-hmm.
that what was once a grief reaction is now turning into what we would classify as clinical depression. They're not one and the same, those types of conditions. Clinical depression is really based upon a sense that a person does not want to necessarily go on living um, without that loved one in their lives. They're not able to make sense of the suffering that they're experiencing. They don't sense things getting any better over time. So there's a certain sense of hopelessness that characterizes those individuals. Situations like that require therapy. They require therapy because a person needs to work through in a safe setting with someone who's trained and has a lot of experience working specifically with people who have been depressed and also people who have been bereaved, to be able to make sense of that with them and to be a partner with them in the processing um, of all the experiences that go along with that journey, that very subjective journey that the person has embarked upon.
Mm-hmm.
So to try and make sense of it all in the presence of someone who can help to guide them through it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I think you just hit on some, like a couple of really major points that I just want to highlight and maybe go into a little bit deeper. You talked a lot about the importance of community and whether that's like a personal network or going to group therapy. Can you explain a little bit more about why support from friends, family, or any other type of community can be helpful in the grief process? How is that helpful therapeutically?
Yes, we as people are social creatures. So certainly when everything is going great and something wonderful happens, if we have no one to share that experience with, it's not the same. It doesn't feel as good when we have people that we're able to share things with, be able to share our emotions with, and we feel connected then to those individuals through the process of sharing emotions. We're able to feel whole. That's all the more applicable when someone is dealing with a loss. And again, loss of someone or something to whom he or she was attached, and now is bereft of that type of attachment, um, is a very discombobulating experience. And that's what sets a person on a tizzy, that whirlwind of emotion, um, which is extremely overwhelming. Having a support system in place lets that individual know that he or she can lose control, can, in a sense, fall apart, and that there's going to be people who are there in their corner who will help them, who will allow them to fall apart safely. That the individual can reconstitute him or themselves in the context of the support that they're going to receive, whether it's tactical, practical support, people helping prepare meals, some doing the housework, taking care of the bills, things as basic as that, taking care of the children, if need be, on one level, but on a deeper level, that when someone is expressing feelings, they don't have to worry that by doing so, people are going to judge them unfavorably. That people will be able to, in fact, relate because they themselves may have gone through similar experiences. So now this individual is feeling part of a greater whole. And a burden shared is a burden halved in many ways, especially when it comes to the experience of grief. That a person, when grieving, feels that there is no control in their lives. So it could be an overwhelming experience. By having people to share that with, so a person is, in a sense, somewhat contained by that group. Um, so it's extremely important to recognize that, especially if someone is not blessed to have that type of support from the community, that all effort be made as part of the healing process to be able to seek out, and elicit the support that is so necessary to help people on their journeys.
Hmm. Okay, so let's get into that a little bit more. So if someone, whether they do or do not have this type of supportive community, but they decide that based on the symptoms they're experiencing from their grief, that they do want to seek help through psychotherapy, how can psychotherapy help someone through their grief?
Okay. So it really depends on the type of person that we're talking about. So there's some people who tend to be more concrete in how they conceptualize things. So in those types of situations, the psychotherapy is going to be more geared to what we would call more solution focused, more hands-on. So for instance, okay, let's talk about your daily routine. Right now, you don't have a daily routine. Right now, you wake up one morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, another morning at 11 in the morning, one morning, you get up at 6 in the morning. Let's talk about how you can maintain some type of regularity to just getting up in the morning to start your day. Oh, you're not eating well, or you're eating too much. Let's try to straighten those types of things out to get you some type of regularity back into your lifestyle. Um, those are more concrete types of plans that psychotherapy can and definitely needs to address. Um, But that's on one type of level. And for some people, that actually may suffice in helping them gain a sense of regularity, routine, control back in their lives that was shaken very deeply by the experience of their loss. Um, However, for those who require more insight into what they're experiencing, so then the psychotherapy is going to take on more of exploration of feelings. And the present dynamic of loss is not going to be just one that is reflected in the here and now, but it's actually going to be a reverberation of past dynamics in which losses have occurred and how they were processed. Oftentimes they were processed in a very healthy way, but unfortunately, sometimes losses of various types were often not processed well because they were often encouraged to be suppressed. And people were not able to give full expression to their emotions at the time because by doing so, either they feared that they might decompensate or they feared that they would be judged unfavorably by their group of peers or even by their own family members. Oftentimes, some people are told, big boys, big girls don't cry, for example. That's a type of very harsh, often dysfunctional message that parents may impart to their children, when they're really young. And children who internalize messages like that, when they're overcome with things like grief 40, 50 years later, may not know how to grieve. And if someone doesn't grieve properly, so I mentioned in passing before that very often those um, feelings may morph not just into mental health issues, but also physical issues as well. People can develop certain medical conditions that are associated with unresolved grief. The cardiovascular system is very much affected by depression that's unresolved, which certainly can be something that's associated certainly very closely with the grief experience. The nervous system in general can be highly reactive to grief reactions that are also not processed well. So that even in its extreme form trauma, loss that occurred in a traumatic fashion can particularly be almost imprinted in a sense on the body, especially the nervous system. The gastrointestinal system can certainly also be affected by the stress that people experience in the course of grief. And if someone does not adequately express what needs to be and process what needs to be processed, as painful as that is, so unfortunately, people can develop certain GI conditions as well. So that's just a smattering of different types of things, how, unresolved grief can affect the body, especially if it's traumatic, can certainly also have its effect on the body. But it's important just to recognize how therapy can sometimes help people work backwards in understanding that the somatic symptoms that they're experiencing may very well have originated from a grief reaction that was not processed in a healthy way.
Mhm.
And when they become more insightfully aware of that connection, that mind-body connection, so very often the somatic symptoms start to resolve as well.
Mhm. Okay, no, that's very insightful, and it's so interesting to hear about the mind-body connection and how you may be experiencing physical symptoms, but it really might be coming from a more mental space. So just to wrap up for the last question, what advice can you give people who are currently feeling hopeless or lost because of grief?
The first thing I would want to emphasize, anyone who's experiencing a sense of hopelessness, is to let them know you're not alone. You're not alone. It is part of the human condition to experience loss. You're not alone. What seems to be insurmountable, just getting through day by day, trying to live without that loved one or loved object, may seem at first to be so dark and so isolating that nobody can relate to that experience. I encourage those individuals to reach out to somebody, not necessarily a psychotherapist, not necessarily. Start with relatives, start with close friends, people who are in your own closest circles. Reach out for that type of support. You'd be surprised just how much people are willing to give of their time, to give of their hearts when you reach out for that type of help. But oftentimes when people are feeling hopeless, it's because they don't envision a future. but that the future doesn't look any brighter than the present, and that they are going to be always mired in this river of grief. They're not going to be able to ever extricate themselves. And it's important at that time to be able to connect with community, connect with family, connect with friends, because that person would be enlightened to understand that, in fact, other people have gone through similar experiences. No two experiences of grief are exactly the same. Everyone's experiences, they're subjectively different from one another. But there are certain commonalities that we as human beings have gone through in a shared journey of grief, of dealing with loss in life, dealing with severance of attachment, to which we are able to have some type of connection. And when we have some type of connection with somebody else who cares, we start to feel a little bit more hopeful. If those individuals were able to get through this, then perhaps I'm going to be able to get through it too. The course of psychotherapy, for those who do need psychotherapy in helping them deal with this extremely disturbing time of life. The major goal of psychotherapy is to help people recognize that better times are yet ahead of them, and that as dark as the current moment is, and in which there's a tremendous amount of empathy, compassion, validation that is expressed in the context of that, whether it's individual psychotherapy, whether it's group psychotherapy, but it's all leading to a brighter tomorrow. And that brighter tomorrow is going to look different than it was in the past.
Such an important message
Yeah.
to share.
It's the concept of post-traumatic growth. And the post-traumatic growth is that when people have been traumatized, but it's not just necessarily traumatized in the sense that their lives were threatened, and they underwent something that was completely overwhelming to the senses, which is more or less what traumatic experiences are all about. But it also includes situations of loss, and often loss entails a certain degree of trauma. So while no one asks to be placed in that type of position, no one asks to suffer a trauma or to suffer a loss of any kind. No one asks to suffer, but that is the lot of life. We can't avoid those experiences in our lives. And can we use the vehicle of suffering to be able to reassess our lives in the process of the psychotherapy, whether group or individual, to reassess what our lives are about, to reassess our values, to reassess our purpose, our meaning in our lives? And that's the existential question that we talked about earlier. Can we reassess all those things and come out as a changed person, so that the process of the psychotherapy is really a holistic one, allows a person to be able to come out growing existentially from the experience of loss, so that their suffering in itself has purpose. Again, never that we ask for it, never that we should ever want to experience those things from the outset, but being that we have to, unfortunately, at times, it's better that we are able to achieve some sense of growth from the process, specifically through the process of suffering in dealing with loss, working through the stages of grief, being able to come out the other end as a changed person, one that is able to be more appreciative of life, one who's able to invest more lovingly in their relationships, and one who's able to have a greater appreciation for where they want their lives to go to. And with that, people maintain a lot more hope. Hope comes right back into their lives. and we're able to have a sense of peace, serenity, tranquility, all the things that we would want to hope for in our lives, and this sense of true inner happiness and joy that is hopefully, what comes about through a successful experience through psychotherapy.
Mhm. No, that's a really important and beautiful message. And if someone wanted to get in touch with you for psychotherapy or other support in other areas, what would be the best way for them to get in touch with you?
So someone interested in contacting my practice is certainly more than welcome to reach out via telephone, area code 516-567-0139. Individuals could also reach out to through my website, hamakome.com. There's a contact page where people can request a consultation. I'd be happy to talk with them about what could be done to help them through perhaps one of the darkest points in their lives. And also there's a space there to be able to email me as well, drmiller@hamakom.com. So those are all different ways that they could reach out to me.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Miller.
Thank you.